Ellen White Reconsidered, a series of presentations on Ellen White and her writings. Today's presentation is a study of Ellen White's early writings, Part 2. Glad you've joined us. Today we're going to take Part 2 of the seminar that was conducted with the Ventura Seventh-day Adventist Church in California, and we're going to respond to the question, what was the influence of her visions on the widening vision of the early Adventists? We've already talked about that to a certain degree, and what I'm going to bring to you at this point is documentary evidence from eyewitnesses, testimony of those that lived it, to understand, did they believe that probation had closed for all people but for Adventists? If that's true, what were the forces that would help them to broaden their vision to say, okay, we're not just gathering people that believed and keep them from losing their faith, but we are expanding our reach to reach other people. And in these early days, they were discouraged. They didn't know what to make of it. And Ellen White writes about that. And I'm just going to select from her letter, one that has been transcribed and that I have here in the background, but just highlighting what she described as her position at the time she had V1, her first vision, okay? She wrote to Joseph Bates, and this is the first preserved letter of hers that we have in possession at the Ellen G. White estate. Perhaps you would like to have me give a statement in relation to both visions. There's the bridegroom vision that she would later have. That's vision 5 that we talked about. And then this is her first vision, those two together. At the time I had the vision of the midnight cry, so she's talking about the first vision, I had given it up in the past and thought it future, as also most of the band had. So when she had this first vision, she thought, this vision flies in the face of what everybody believes. Who's going to accept it? And moreover, I'm just a young person and a weak person at that. She suffered from something that we would probably diagnose as tuberculosis at the time. She had to sleep sitting up because she was bleeding in her lungs, and she would cough up a lot of blood. That was her condition when she had this first vision. So she's weak, she's young, and she's got a message that she thinks is not going to resonate with the believers. And so she, at first, if you read the account in early writings, you'd think it was immediate. But she writes in a letter afterwards that she was reticent to share it with the group because she was afraid, because they all believed that October of 1844 had been a mistake. The whole thing had been a mistake. And that they just needed to look for some new date in the future. And so she didn't know what to do with this. And then a fellow came whose name was Joseph Turner, and he asked her, are you in God's will? And she was fighting against it because she knew she had received this vision, and she didn't know what to say to him, so she dismissed herself and she went upstairs. Later he came and caught up with her, and he said, what did you have in your vision? And she finally told him, and he said, well, that's just what I said last night. Those are conclusions that I came to studying the Bible. And she was blown away. And so then she said, all right, Lord, if I feel well enough to go home, I'll go and I'll present it. And so then she does. She goes home, which is just across town, because this first vision, remember, was at Elizabeth Haynes' house, which is on the way out of town, going across there's a bridge there, the Vaughan Bridge, and her folks were a little bit further inland. So she took a sleigh. It's middle of winter. She took a sleigh home, and as she got home, the meeting was over, so there was nothing discussed. The next meeting that she goes to, she presents the first vision, and to her amazement, they all embraced it. So there's that gap in her story. She says, I had the vision, I shared it, and they all embraced it. Yeah, they did, but she was about to run away from it and afraid to do it, and then God used this man, Joseph Turner, to encourage her to share it, and then she does. Joseph Turner, in the end, ends up becoming her adversary in some ways, because He follows his own notions, and the Lord also called him out on his behavior. He told others that she was being hypnotized, and that either self-hypnotism or James White was hypnotizing her. She had a number of visions when James wasn't around, so obviously that wasn't the case. But it's understandable to me why he would conclude that, and you will hear people explain away what she had as an experience because they use the filter of what they have seen and what they have witnessed to say it must have been that, you know. And Joseph Turner was able to hypnotize people. They called it mesmerism at the time, but Joseph Turner hypnotized people to get and to see an amazing thing. You know, you've seen people that said, all right, I want you to stand up and I want you to walk around and quack like a duck. You know, and you see these grown people under the influence of hypnotism, going, quack, 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 you know, doing weird things. Well, he did some other things, not exactly that, but other things that I was able to find in a newspaper article. So it becomes clear that he was interpreting her through the lens of his own understanding, as often human beings do, but not looking at the evidence that is clearly evident. And we will get to that under our third topic. All right, so that's the first piece of evidence, is we're looking at her own testimony that the vision changed her mind and the mind of the Portland Adventists. And then as she began to share it in Poland and in Orrington, rest of Maine, that she goes to New Hampshire, to Vermont, then goes to Boston, she begins to travel around in New England, sharing this message. It has an influence on others to begin to see that, first of all, God was in the message, but then in this very first vision, she talks about the 144,000 living saints. And at its peak, the Advent movement boasted 50,000 adherents. Somebody do some quick math on that. How much is 50,000 to 144,000?
Most of a third.
It's about, a third.
Yeah. So clearly, even if you take that as a literal number, she knows that there are more than just the Adventists who are supposed to receive the message. And that's in the very first message that she has. But then there are other things along the way that we're going to look at, some evidences from some of the people. She commented on this for those who were saying that her first message taught that only Adventists could be saved. She says, no reference is made to those who had not seen the light and therefore were not guilty of its rejection. See, there was a supposition by many Adventists that if you weren't part of the movement, you had seen the evidence and you had rejected it. But she's saying here that there were people who had not seen the evidence and had not rejected it. So there's a group outside of those who had turned away from the Advent message. Here's some examples, and I just listed several as I began to study. These are people: John Yale Wilcox, Hiram and Sarah Ann Patch, Heman Allen Churchill, Luman Maston, and even Marion Stoll, who will use their testimony later. All of these were not adherents to the Advent message in 1844, but they became acquainted with Adventists. They were impressed by the message. In a couple instances, they married an Adventist, but they were not resistant to the message. They accepted it, and they became very influential. Now, Luman Maston is an interesting case because he was the pressman when this book was published, when the first book was published, and he moved with them from Saratoga Springs, New York, to, what's the next town that they went to? Anyway, he went with them, and he ended up dying there of tuberculosis. But before he did, he has a tremendous testimony of how he recognized the truth of the Sabbath. He embraced it. They loved him. This group of people accepted him. In each of these stories, there's a story of what we might call friendship evangelism. These are people that are connected to these people. They see the quality of their lives. They hear the message. They're impressed, and they join the movement, even though they weren't Adventists beforehand. All right, so that's another piece of evidence. Here's another. Marion Truesdale, the last one on that list, who was not a believer at the time, though her parents were. She said, regarding a girl kept from attending meetings by her father, Ellen had told her, God never has shown me that there is no salvation for such persons. It is only those who have had the light of truth presented to them and knowingly rejected it. Because what can you do for somebody who sees the truth, knows the truth, and then discards it? Today I preached the follow-up story to the raising of Lazarus. And there's an amazing story that comes with that. Right after Lazarus is reunited with his weeping and mourning sisters, it says immediately that there were many of the Jews who began to believe in Jesus at that time. Now, when we say the Jews, that's pretty significant because it means Jewish leaders. And there were many who received Jesus after that event, but then it says, but some went and reported it to the authorities in Jerusalem. So we see here that there are people, and of those people who reported it, they knew that the miracle had happened. They knew it was true, but they rejected it. What can you do for somebody who knows the truth, but knowingly rejects it? That's who she's addressing here, right? Okay. Here's another. This is regarding Vision 36. Another occasion worthy of mention was a vision given in 1846 in Paris, Maine. Miss Harmon was shown that when Satan could not prevent the honest-hearted from doing their whole duty, he would exert his skill in pushing them beyond duty. One good sister had been telling the churches that God had rejected them because they had rejected the message sent from heaven to save them. Sister Harmon was shown that there was no truth in her message, as there were many in the churches who would yet embrace the truth that the good angels would leave her, that is the sister, at the door of the church if she went there upon such an errand. So she's giving a kind of, this lady was giving a condemnatory message, and Jesus tells Ellen, no, there are people in those churches who haven't heard the message yet, who will yet receive it. Another piece of evidence. There's another one from Ellen White, reported by Loughborough, regarding her April 3, 1847 vision. Ellen White wrote, I saw that God had children who did not see and keep the Sabbath. So you can see there's an openness that she has, that she's reporting. Ira Abbey, who's a believer in New York, and his daughter is the Lucinda Hall, that was a close friend of Ellen's. Some of you may know that. But she was, he was so an early believer. He said, never do I remember of hearing Sister White say there was no hopes of the unconverted, but there were hopes of the backslidden and those that had not rejected the truth. Again, we see that there is an openness. She's not purporting to believe in the close of probation. In 1874, Jane Andrews, who had known Ellen White since 1844, along with 6 other early Adventists, they signed the same statement. He says, at a later point, while many of the Advent people were still firm in the belief that there was no salvation for sinners, she, that is Ellen White, was shown with respect to the open and shut door of Revelation 3, in which the whole subject was explained in the light of the heavenly sanctuary. Thus, instead of the visions leading them to adopt this view, it corrected them upon this point while they were holding it. So it is the visions that actually opens the way for Adventists to see this broader work. It's pretty amazing. So, and before I go to the next question, I just want to make one observation from one of the general conferences. They have a parade of nations. It's quite impressive because we begin to see how broad the Advent message is and where we are in the world, how many nations we're in the world. But in one of the GC sessions, they chose to do the parade of nations according to the chronological entry into the various countries. And so you begin to see where they went first and in the opening way. And then as you attach dates to it, you begin to see as this opening message begins to spread, you first understand that it's largely in New England. You know, the church is largely in New England. But it doesn't take long till it spreads into New York, which they don't consider themselves New England. And then from New York to Michigan, and from Michigan to Wisconsin, and then into California, and then finally into the South. And then while this is going on, they start sending missionaries, or sending literature at least, to Europe. And then eventually they have strong works in all those places. And then they start sending messengers into South America, into Africa, into Australia, and you see the spread of the message. And it is this broadening message that we see. And if you look at the dates, it's like a mushroom of activity, just as they start spreading to here and there, as individuals take up the message, names that we don't even know. They're not well known to us, even if you've studied Adventist history, because it's as each individual person took it on themselves to share the message with people who spoke the language that was their native language. It began to spread dramatically. And as they went into countries where they didn't even speak the language. And so it's a beautiful story of the spread of the Advent message. As Jesus said, go ye into all the world and preach the gospel.